One thing I want to get to, because we've seen in these situations with these banks, even in situations of settlements, of fraud, where they don't have to admit wrongdoing, they don't have to admit or deny guilt, this recurring situation where you have banks basically looking like they make out pretty well in these settlements over any of these issues. And then anybody else that goes against that, on the other side of it, it's kind of like, good luck for you, or, you know, woe is me if you try to go up against the banks. You've written extensively about the $25 billion mortgage settlement, which really, I think, and I think you might agree, illustrates this dynamic very well. Since you know it so well, I was wondering if you could maybe just break that down a little bit for our viewers, how that's a good example of this dynamic.
Well, first thing, even the whole fact that the headline is $25 billion. I'll get to that in a minute. What they're paying is much less than $25 billion. That's bad enough. But $25 billion is merely, even if you believe the analysis that they started out earlier in the negotiations with, it was sort of a back-of-the-envelope calculation of servicing fees they made they weren't entitled to. There's no element of damages in that number. That's merely a recoupment. Okay. Now, if you were going to have any kind of notion of punishment, you'd actually have real damages or real penalties of some sort on top of just disgorgement. This is basically a disgorgement level number.
Okay. So first takeaway, this is not a punishment for the banks.
It's not. The number isn't even a punishment number. That's to start with. And the second is then that $25 billion number has so much air in it, it's not even funny. For instance, $5 billion of it is cash payments. In one component is, I think it's about $3 billion for, I think that's the right number, for payments just to people who were foreclosed upon. They're going to depend on how many people sign up, but people who are foreclosed on a certain period of time, they're going to get $1,500 to $2,000. Well, that's great. It's for people who actually were going to lose their houses. They're getting money that even then didn't cover enough for them to maybe move. Yeah. And then for people who lost them wrongfully, it's a joke. I mean, it's just it's insulting. But the second part is that even in that $5 billion, they are rolling into this settlement all kinds of punishments that they're rolling into it and waiving fines that they were owed. So I think there was $780 billion of fines they owed the Fed. There were nearly $400 billion of fines they owed the OCC. And that's only the sum total. So they say it's that the cash portion is $5 billion, but there's already more than $1 billion of fines they're not paying. So even that, even the number people like to talk about, oh, at least that's a hard number. They're paying $5 billion. Even that part's baloney.
That doesn't look at what they are being forgiven from paying.
Forgiven. So that's one part. Then the second part is that they've got $20 billion, which is basically credits for various activities. So it's credits for, some of it's for things like refinancing. There's $17 billion of it is for principal modifications and other activities. And that's got a lot of garbage in it too. I mean, for example, they get credit for writing off what they call forbearance. So let's say they've foreclosed on somebody, the loan was for $200,000, but the house only got sold for, $140,000. So theoretically, they could go after the borrower for $60,000. In practice, most of these borrowers, if you lose your house, you don't have any money left. There's no blood to get from this stone. But nevertheless, they get to write off, and they get to collect 10% credit of the amount they write off. What do you think these banks are going to do? They're going to write off the ones they weren't going to go after anyhow. The ones that there's some evidence that the person might have money, they'll keep those and pursue those people.
Right.
So they're getting credit for junk.
Wow.
And Dave Dayen has looked through that, and he's basically said of the supposed foreclosure, of that sort of portion of the settlement, he says about, basically about a quarter of it is these kind of, what amount to junk credits. And then even in the most heinous part, though, is the principal modifications are required to, they're asked to do. Mm-hmm. HUD keeps giving this messaging, which is nonsense. They get credit both for ones that they own. So the ones they own, they would take some kind of loss, but they've already been modifying mortgages. So they'll be getting credit, where it makes economic sense. Mm-hmm. So they'll get credit for mortgages they would have probably modified anyhow. But then they'll also get credit for modifying mortgages owned by investors. So they're getting credit. Wow. From money that's taken from people that isn't even their money. And the HUD says basically, oh well, these the investors will come out ahead anyhow. A, that's not the point. The point is that shouldn't be counted as a
doesn't
credit.
matter.
It doesn't count. And B, the investors basically say, yes, we're not opposed to modifications, but these were first liens. The banks still own a lot of second liens. Don't touch our first till the bank's second is wiped out. The settlement doesn't require that. Instead, there's a complicated formula, but basically, they're written, it roughly works out to that they're written down pro rata. That's wrong. The second is supposed to go.
Okay.
And
Eve, I'm sorry, we're almost out of time. I have to wrap up, but I do want to know where you think banks derive this power when they're dealing with the law.
It's because they are the second biggest donors the second of the healthcare industry in presidential and congressional campaigns. It's all about the campaign money.
And that goes when it comes to dealing with the law and contracts and every aspect of this kind of a deal?
Well, the other issue, it's not so much in the mortgage settlement. I mean, it applies in the other areas of business, though. The other part is that because they run these, we talked about the derivatives before in the bond markets, the biggest banks also are very powerful. They basically got a private network. And so much of funding, like the securitization markets, even though it might have started out as a loan, ultimately gets sold in the bond markets.
Okay.
And because they control these markets and they become so important to commerce, it's almost like they've got it's almost like we've got a society where they're the equivalent of the guys who own the nuclear power reactor, and we don't have much in the way of other sources of power, and nobody knows how to run the nuclear power reactor, so we're hostage to the guys who run the nuclear power reactor.
And if you do anything to sabotage that or threaten that, we're going to blow it up, is what they say.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on the show. It was really nice to talk to you and get all of your expertise. That was Eve Smith, author of Naked Capitalism and the book Econned.